welcome back. Before we begin, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from, your city, your country, even your state. Tonight's story comes from Natchez, Mississippi, 1856, a town built on wealth, power, and silence. What you're about to hear is not a legend made for shock. It's a dark narrative pieced together from court whispers, plantation records, and buried accounts that took years of careful research to uncover. If you value true historical crime stories told with honesty, make sure you subscribe now, because stories like this demand time, patience, and respect for real lives lost. Now listen closely, because Natchez once froze in fear of a boy no one was supposed to notice. Natchez plantation aristocracy represented one of the most powerful and insulated elite classes in the American South during the mid-1800s. By 1856, Natchez stood as a symbol of extreme wealth, built almost entirely on enslaved labor. The city's grand mansions, overlooking the Mississippi River, were owned by families whose fortunes came from cotton plantations stretching for miles. These aristocrats viewed themselves not merely as landowners, but as natural rulers, people destined by birth, race, and wealth to command both land and lives. At the center of this aristocratic world was cotton, often called white gold. Natchez planters controlled massive fields worked by hundreds of enslaved people, many of whom were purchased, bred, or traded like livestock. The success of a planter family was measured by land size, cotton yield, and enslaved population. Wealth created tight social circles where marriages, business deals, and political influence remained within a small group, reinforcing power that few outsiders could ever challenge. Social life among Natchez elites was carefully choreographed. Lavish balls, riverfront dinners, and formal gatherings filled the calendar, all designed to display refinement and dominance. Beneath the music and silk dresses, however, lay a constant fear of rebellion. Aristocrats spoke openly of honor and Christian values while privately obsessing over control, punishments, surveillance, and discipline were routine tools used to maintain order on their plantations. The legal system overwhelmingly favored the aristocracy. Courts, sheriff, and local militias were often relatives, business partners, or social allies of plantation owners. Crimes committed by elites were quietly dismissed, while accusations against enslaved people required little proof. Enslaved voices held no legal weight, and violence against them was rarely questioned, allowing planters to act with near-total impunity. Despite their confidence, Natchez aristocrats lived with an underlying anxiety. They were vastly outnumbered by the enslaved population, and rumors of uprisings, real or imagined, spread quickly. Night patrols, curfews, and harsh punishments were signs of a ruling class that ruled through fear as much as wealth. Every unexplained death, illness, or fire sparked suspicion that the system they relied on might one day turn against them. Religion and social ideology were used to justify this structure. Planters portrayed slavery as a civilizing mission, claiming moral authority while benefiting from cruelty. Children of aristocratic families were raised to believe dominance was natural and necessary, while enslaved children were taught obedience through violence. This ideological divide shaped every interaction within Natchez society. By 1856, the Natchez plantation aristocracy appeared unshakable, but beneath the polished surface, cracks were forming. Their power depended on silence, fear, and denial of humanity. When whispers began to circulate about unexplained deaths and a hidden figure moving unnoticed through their world, it threatened not just individual lives, but the illusion of absolute control that defined the aristocracy itself. 1856 Mississippi social hierarchy was rigid, unforgiving, and designed to protect those at the very top while crushing anyone below. Society was divided into clearly defined layers, and movement between them was almost impossible. Wealthy white plantation owners sat at the peak, followed by smaller landholders, merchants, overseers, poor whites, and at the very bottom, the enslaved population. This hierarchy was not informal. It shaped law, religion, education, and daily life across Mississippi. At the top were the planter elites, often called the Southern aristocracy. These families controlled land, politics, and justice, and their status was inherited through bloodlines and marriage. A person's value was measured by how much land they owned and how many enslaved people they controlled. Power was visible in grand homes, private tutors, and political influence, reinforcing the idea that authority belonged to a select few. Below them were non-elite whites, small farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who owned little or no land. Though economically vulnerable, they were still granted social superiority over enslaved people. This false sense of racial privilege was used to maintain loyalty to the system. Even when struggling, poor whites were taught to defend slavery because it preserved their place above the bottom tier. Overseers and slave patrols occupied a dangerous middle position. They enforced discipline on plantations, but were rarely respected by the aristocracy. Their role required cruelty, surveillance, and punishment, making them both feared and despised. These men acted as the system's muscle, ensuring control while absorbing much of the resentment generated by the hierarchy. Enslaved people formed the foundation of the entire structure, yet were denied recognition as human beings. They had no legal identity, no rights, and no protection. Families could be separated without warning, labor was forced from childhood, and resistance, whether spoken or silent, was met with extreme punishment. The hierarchy depended on their suffering while refusing to acknowledge their humanity. The legal system reinforced this structure at every level. Courts rarely challenged the word of a white citizen, especially a planter. Enslaved testimony was often forbidden, and violence against them was treated as property damage rather than crime. Justice flowed upward, never downward, ensuring the hierarchy remained intact. By 1856, this social order appeared stable but was deeply fragile. It relied on fear, silence, and constant enforcement. Any disruption, rumors, unexplained deaths, or acts of resistance threatened to expose how artificial and violent the hierarchy truly was. When fear began to rise among those at the top, it revealed a system terrified of the very people it claimed to dominate. Enslaved childhood under brutality was a reality shaped by violence from the very first memories a child formed. In Mississippi during the 1850s, enslaved children were not protected by age or innocence. They were born into ownership, meaning their bodies, labor, and futures belonged to someone else before they could even speak. Childhood, as understood by free society, did not exist for them. It was replaced by early conditioning through fear. From as young as 5 or 6, enslaved children were assigned tasks meant to prepare them for lifelong labor. Carrying water, tending animals, cleaning yards, or watching younger children were not lessons but training. Mistakes were met with punishment, not correction. Overseers and owners believed pain was an effective teacher, and discipline was often public to ensure other children learned obedience without questioning. Physical brutality was constant and unpredictable. Whippings, beatings, and confinement were used not only for disobedience, but for exhaustion, illness, or perceived attitude. Children learned quickly that crying invited harsher punishment. Silence became a survival skill. Many learned to read moods, footsteps, and tones of voice better than words, because anticipation could mean the difference between pain and survival. Psychological cruelty ran just as deep. Enslaved children were forced to watch family members punished or sold away, teaching them that attachment was dangerous. Parents were powerless to protect their own children, which broke family bonds and replaced trust with fear. Owners often used children as leverage, threatening harm to control entire families. Education was deliberately denied. Teaching enslaved children to read or write was illegal or violently discouraged because knowledge was seen as dangerous. Instead, children were taught their place through repetition and humiliation. They were told they were inferior, destined to serve, and incapable of independence, lies reinforced daily through treatment and conditions. Despite this, enslaved children developed quiet forms of resistance. They shared whispered stories, memorized songs with hidden meanings, and learned to disappear emotionally when necessary. Some observed everything in silence, storing memories rather than reacting. This forced awareness often made them grow up faster, sharper, and more alert than anyone realized. By adolescence, the brutality had shaped them into tools the system believed it controlled, but it also created deep, unspoken scars. For some, the trauma produced fear and submission. For others, it created something far more dangerous to the ruling class: patience, memory, and the ability to wait. In a world built on underestimating enslaved children, that silence could become a weapon. Silence as survival was one of the most powerful and necessary strategies for enslaved people living under constant threat. In 1850s Mississippi, speaking too much, reacting too quickly, or showing emotion could invite punishment. Enslaved individuals, especially children, learned early that silence was not weakness, but protection. Remaining unnoticed often meant staying alive. On plantations, every word was measured. Enslaved people understood that anything they said could be twisted, reported, or used against them. A careless comment overheard by an overseer or a favored house servant could result in beatings or worse. Silence became a shield, allowing them to move through dangerous spaces without drawing attention. This silence extended beyond speech into behavior. Facial expressions were controlled, posture was managed, and emotions were hidden. Showing anger was dangerous. Showing intelligence could be seen as threatening. Even showing grief too openly could be punished. Survival meant mastering invisibility, learning how to exist without being fully seen. Children adapted to this reality faster than adults. Growing up under brutality, they learned when to lower their eyes, when to disappear into corners, and when to pretend not to hear. Silence became instinctive, not taught. Many learned to listen more than they spoke, absorbing information while revealing nothing about themselves. Silence also protected others. Enslaved people often withheld information to shield family members or friends. Refusing to speak, even under pain, was sometimes the only way to prevent further harm. This form of silence required immense strength, as it meant enduring suffering to protect someone else. At the same time, silence allowed observation. Those who spoke less noticed more patterns of movement, routines, weaknesses, and moods. Over time, this quiet awareness created a deep understanding of the plantation's inner workings. Silence, while imposed, became a tool that could be repurposed. To the ruling class, silence was misread as submission. Planters believed quiet, enslaved people were obedient and harmless. What they failed to understand was that silence often masked memory, calculation, and restraint. In a system that relied on underestimating the powerless, silence was not empty, it was waiting. Unrecorded plantation deaths were a hidden but common reality across Mississippi plantations in the mid-1800s. Official records focused on property, harvests, and profits, not on the lives lost within plantation boundaries. When an enslaved person died, the event was often reduced to a brief note, a replacement purchase, or nothing at all. Death, especially among the enslaved, was treated as routine loss rather than tragedy. Plantation owners had little incentive to document deaths honestly. Recording violence, neglect, or suspicious circumstances could invite questions from authorities or damage reputations among neighboring elites. As a result, many deaths were explained away as illness, accidents, or natural causes, even when brutality or exhaustion was the real reason. Silence protected the system and those who benefited from it. Medical care for enslaved people was minimal and often delayed. Injuries from labor, punishment, or malnutrition frequently went untreated. Children and elderly enslaved individuals were especially vulnerable, and their deaths were rarely investigated. If someone died in the fields, cabins, or outbuildings, the body might be buried quickly with no marker and no record beyond whispered acknowledgement. Violence contributed heavily to these unrecorded deaths. Overseer punishment, owner cruelty, and forced labor pushed bodies past endurance. Because enslaved people were considered property, death was framed as economic loss rather than criminal act. This mindset allowed extreme abuse to continue without accountability. Plantations also concealed deaths among the white population when it suited them. Conflicts, accidents, or internal disputes were sometimes hidden to preserve family honor. In elite society, reputation mattered more than truth. When someone of status died under questionable circumstances, stories were adjusted, delayed, or buried entirely. Rumors often filled the gaps left by missing records. Enslaved communities remembered names, faces, and stories long after official documents erased them. These oral histories preserved truths that plantation books never acknowledged. What was unrecorded on paper survived in memory. By 1856, the accumulation of unexplained deaths, enslaved and free, created an atmosphere of unease. When deaths went uncounted and causes unspoken, fear grew quietly. In Natchez, the absence of records did not mean the absence of violence. It meant the truth was buried deep. Waiting to be uncovered was an unspoken but constant presence beneath their displays of confidence and power. In places like Natchez, wealthy plantation owners projected authority through grand homes, social rituals, and strict control over others. Yet behind closed doors, many lived with the awareness that their dominance rested on fragile ground. They were few in number, surrounded by far more people they oppressed and controlled through force. This fear was rooted in numbers. Enslaved people often outnumbered white families on large plantations by 10 to 1 or more. Elites understood that their safety depended on obedience, surveillance, and intimidation. Any sign of unrest, a missing tool, a whispered conversation, a fire at night, could trigger panic. The system required constant vigilance because it was built against the will of the majority. Rumors spread quickly among the elite class. Stories of poisonings, secret meetings, or violent revenge, whether true or exaggerated, circulated at dinner tables and private gatherings. Even unverified tales were enough to harden attitudes and increase brutality. Fear made elites more suspicious, more isolated, and more willing to punish preemptively. Nighttime intensified this anxiety. Plantations fell silent after dark, and darkness was seen as dangerous territory. Slave patrols increased, weapons were kept close, and doors were locked. The same elites who preached order and control feared the night because it symbolized everything they could not see or fully command. This fear extended beyond enslaved people to other elites. Rivalries, inheritance disputes, and business conflicts created mistrust within aristocratic circles. A sudden illness or unexplained death raised questions no one wanted to ask aloud. To preserve unity, many chose silence over investigation, allowing fear to grow unchecked. Publicly, elites denied this anxiety. Admitting fear would mean admitting weakness in the system itself. Instead, they blamed outside influences, abolitionists, travelers, or bad slaves, rather than acknowledging that oppression naturally produced resistance. The harsher the control, the more fragile their sense of security became. By 1856, fear among Southern elites was no longer just a background emotion. It shaped decisions, punishments, and relationships. It froze communities into suspicion and paranoia. In Natchez, that fear would soon focus on a single, unsettling idea that danger did not always come from rebellion in numbers, but from what they had long been trained to overlook. Was the foundation of Southern society in 1856, shaping every interaction on plantations and in towns like Natchez. Wealthy white planters held nearly absolute authority over enslaved people, controlling their labor, movement, families, and even thoughts. This imbalance was not just economic, it was legal, social, and psychological. Enslaved individuals had no recognized rights, while the planter class had nearly unlimited power to punish, coerce, or sell. This power imbalance was maintained through constant surveillance and violence. Overseers, patrols, and sometimes family members acted as enforcers, ensuring that enslaved people complied with orders. Every task, every word, every gesture was monitored. Fear of punishment reinforced submission, and rebellion was met with swift, often brutal consequences. This system relied on the understanding that one side's freedom was built entirely on another's oppression. Legally, enslaved people were considered property, not persons. Courts, contracts, and local laws protected the rights of owners and punished those who challenged them. Any resistance was framed as theft, insubordination, or criminal behavior. This legal structure reinforced the imbalance, making it nearly impossible for an enslaved person to seek justice or protection. Economically, power imbalance was equally stark. Planters profited from the labor skills and even the reproduction of enslaved people, turning human life into financial gain. The wealth of the South rested on this extraction, making the subjugation of enslaved people essential to elite lifestyles. Every ounce of labor was demanded, and every moment of resistance threatened the economic order. Socially, hierarchy dictated behavior. Enslaved people were denied education, autonomy, and social standing, while planters reinforced their superiority through public rituals, manners, and displays of wealth. Even small freedoms, walking unaccompanied, speaking freely, or forming friendships, were controlled. The imbalance extended into every corner of daily life, creating an environment of constant domination. Psychologically, the imbalance created tension and internalized oppression. Enslaved individuals often had to hide intelligence, suppress natural curiosity, and feign compliance to survive. Meanwhile, planters justified cruelty through ideology, religion, and a sense of racial entitlement. The imbalance was reinforced not just by law and violence, but by deeply ingrained beliefs about who deserved power and who did not. Despite its strength, the power imbalance was not absolute. Enslaved people found ways to resist, survive, and sometimes turn the system's rules against it. Observing, learning, and silently maneuvering allowed them to challenge authority in ways the elite could rarely predict. By 1856, the imbalance created fear as much as control, revealing that the power of the plantation rested on fragile assumptions that a single, underestimated boy in Natchez would soon test. Played a crucial role in shaping how Natchez and similar southern towns remembered, or deliberately forgot, events surrounding enslaved communities. In 1856, the official record was sparse, selective, and often manipulated to protect the elite. Plantation owners, courts, and local officials wrote what served their interests, leaving large gaps where the lives, deaths, and actions of enslaved people were concerned. In those gaps, rumors filled the void. Rumors spread quickly among both the enslaved population and the elite. For enslaved people, whispered stories about secret acts of resistance, hidden punishments, or mysterious deaths carried warnings, lessons, and sometimes hope. These oral traditions preserved truths that would never be acknowledged in official documents. They created a shared memory that reinforced community bonds, even under surveillance and fear. Among the elite, rumors sparked paranoia. Stories of unexplained deaths, strange sightings, or defiance in the fields could inflame suspicion and fear. Even unverified tales could dictate how planters disciplined enslaved people, showing how gossip sometimes influenced real-world decisions more than law or evidence. Rumors became a tool of control as much as they were a reflection of anxiety. Written history, on the other hand, often erased or sanitized these stories. Court records might list deaths as accidents or illnesses. Plantation ledgers counted property but not lives, and newspapers rarely acknowledged the suffering or agency of the enslaved. What was inconvenient, scandalous, or threatening to elite reputations was simply omitted. In this way, history became a version of events designed to protect power rather than reveal truth. The tension between rumor and written history highlights the difficulty of reconstructing events like those in Natchez. Scholars rely on diaries, letters, oral accounts, and indirect evidence to piece together stories that official documents ignore. Every rumor that survives carries fragments of truth, even if distorted by fear, exaggeration, or memory over time. For the enslaved, rumors were more than idle talk, they were survival guides. They taught who could be trusted, what dangers to avoid, and which behaviors to mimic or conceal. In a system designed to suppress knowledge, oral traditions preserved a form of history that the elite could never fully control. By 1856, this clash between rumor and written history created a town where fear, uncertainty, and speculation thrived. Natchez's elites relied on documents to assert control, but the whispered truths circulating among the enslaved undermined that control in ways the written record could never capture. The gap between recorded history and lived experience became a breeding ground for mystery, suspicion, and stories of deeds that would haunt the town for years to come. Was a cornerstone of Southern society in 1856, particularly in Natchez, where social hierarchy dictated the outcome of every dispute. In this society, being born into wealth, land, or racial privilege almost guaranteed impunity. The elite controlled courts, law enforcement, and public opinion, ensuring that their actions were rarely questioned, while the enslaved and poor whites were vulnerable to punishment for even minor infractions. Enslaved people had no legal standing. Crimes committed against them, assault, theft, or even murder, were almost never prosecuted. Owners could punish, sell, or kill without consequence, and the law often treated such acts as property loss rather than violations against human beings. The system effectively erased justice for those at the bottom, making survival more important than fairness. Even free whites were subject to this unequal system. Status, family connections, and wealth often determined how disputes were handled. A wealthy planter accused of wrongdoing could rely on influence, loyal witnesses, and sympathetic judges to avoid punishment. Conversely, someone with little social standing faced harsher sentences for similar or lesser offenses, reinforcing the social hierarchy. This denial of justice extended beyond individual acts to systemic issues. Enslaved people had no recourse for exploitation, theft of labor, or coerced reproduction. Laws existed primarily to protect the economic and social interests of the elite, ensuring that power remained concentrated. Any attempt to seek fairness was often met with hostility or violence. Violence and fear reinforced this imbalance. Public punishments, whippings, and executions served as warnings, demonstrating that justice was selective. For the elite, enforcing harsh measures was a way to maintain control. For the oppressed, it reinforced the impossibility of appealing to law or fairness. The spectacle of punishment made compliance a necessity. Social perception further distorted justice. Communities often turned a blind eye to abuses by prominent families, while scrutinizing the actions of the enslaved or lower-class whites. Reputation and appearances mattered more than truth, meaning that crimes could be hidden, rewritten, or blamed on those who had no power to defend themselves. By 1856, in Natchez, the denial of justice had become a self-reinforcing cycle. Fear, status, and selective enforcement ensured that the powerful remained untouchable, while those at the bottom lived under constant threat. This environment created conditions where unchecked cruelty could thrive and where extraordinary acts of resistance, even by a single enslaved boy, could disrupt the carefully maintained order, was a pervasive element of life in Natchez during 1856, fueled by the extreme social and racial inequalities of the time. Among the elite, fear of rebellion, theft, or betrayal created a tense and suspicious atmosphere. Plantation owners and their families constantly watched the movements of the enslaved population, interpreting even minor irregularities as potential threats. This paranoia shaped behavior, decisions, and social interactions across the town. Planters often relied on surveillance networks to maintain control. Overseers, drivers, and loyal enslaved individuals were tasked with reporting any sign of disobedience or conspiratorial activity. Even casual conversations, glances, or gestures could be misinterpreted as plots against the household. This constant vigilance fostered a climate where suspicion replaced trust, leaving elites anxious and reactive at all times. Rumors amplified paranoia. Stories of poisonings, secret gatherings, and mysterious death spread quickly, often exaggerated with each retelling. While some were grounded in fact, others were imagined or used strategically by elites to justify stricter control. These rumors created an echo chamber of fear that made ordinary daily life tense and unpredictable for everyone involved. Among the enslaved population, paranoia existed for entirely different reasons. Constant fear of punishment, separation from family, or sudden violence required vigilance and caution. Every interaction was carefully calculated to avoid suspicion, making silence and observation crucial survival strategies. This mutual distrust between enslaved individuals and plantation authorities reinforced the overall atmosphere of tension. Even social gatherings for the elite were influenced by paranoia. Formal events, banquets, and dances were not only displays of wealth, but also opportunities to monitor rivals, assess loyalty, and assert dominance. Beneath the veneer of sophistication, fear of scandal, theft, or hidden rebellion shaped behavior and decision-making, demonstrating that paranoia was as social as it was personal. Paranoia was also intergenerational. Children of plantation owners were raised to fear the enslaved and to accept surveillance and control as normal. They inherited suspicion as a form of education, learning that the stability of their wealth and safety depended on constant vigilance. Likewise, enslaved children were taught to conceal knowledge and intentions, reinforcing cycles of secrecy on both sides. By 1856, community paranoia in Natchez had become a self-perpetuating system. The elite's fear of losing control, combined with the oppressed population's need for survival, created an environment where trust was nearly impossible. In such a climate, a single unexpected event, such as the mysterious actions of a clever or defiant enslaved boy, could send shockwaves through the town, exposing the fragility of a society built on fear and oppression. Were a tragic and deliberate consequence of the social, legal, and cultural structures in Natchez and the broader South during 1856. Enslaved people lived full lives with stories, struggles, and acts of resistance, yet the historical record rarely acknowledged them. Plantation records focused on crops, finances, and property, treating enslaved people as commodities rather than individuals with voices or experiences. This systemic erasure made their lives nearly invisible in official history. Stories of family, community, and personal achievement were suppressed or ignored. Enslaved people had rich oral traditions, passing down knowledge, folklore, and histories through song, storytelling, and secret teachings. These narratives were often the only record of daily life and survival, yet they existed outside written archives and were vulnerable to being forgotten when communities were disrupted by sales, deaths, or forced relocations. Acts of resistance, both subtle and overt, were often erased or reframed. Running away, sabotaging equipment, or even minor defiance were frequently documented as misbehavior, or simply ignored, denying enslaved individuals recognition for courage or strategy. By removing these stories from public record, the elite reinforced the illusion that enslaved people were passive, obedient, and without agency. The erasure extended to violence inflicted by enslavers. Brutality, murders, and harsh punishments were seldom recorded in detail. When they were, the focus was on property loss or economic impact rather than human suffering. This selective recording created a historical landscape where the oppressor's perspective dominated, leaving the true experiences of Black individuals largely untold. Even surviving narratives were often filtered through white perspectives. Diaries, letters, or reports sometimes mentioned enslaved people, but their voices were mediated through interpretation bias or patronizing attitudes. As a result, the authentic thoughts, feelings, and intentions of enslaved individuals were rarely preserved in their own words, further silencing their experiences. The consequences of these erased narratives are profound. For generations, descendants of enslaved people struggled to reconstruct family histories, identities, and legacies. Without written documentation, much of the lived reality, joys, sorrows, strategies for survival, was left to memory and oral tradition, making historical reconstruction a complex and often incomplete task. By 1856, the systematic erasure of Black narratives ensured that towns like Natchez could maintain the illusion of control, stability, and cultural dominance. But beneath the surface, these untold stories persisted in whispers, memories, and acts of subtle defiance. While the official record remained silent, the legacy of these hidden narratives would continue to shape history and challenge the dominant narrative for generations to come. Is central to understanding how stories of extraordinary figures, especially enslaved individuals, emerged in places like Natchez in 1856. In a society structured on fear, power, and oppression, the line between reality and legend often blurred. Ordinary actions could be exaggerated, whispered rumors could transform into widespread belief, and a single individual's deeds, real or imagined, could come to symbolize resistance, cunning, or terror. The man at the center of such stories was often an enslaved person whose intelligence, courage, or defiance made them stand out in a world designed to erase individuality. Their survival strategies, silence, observation, subtle resistance, were not just practical but symbolic. Over time, their real-life actions could be magnified, interpreted, or misinterpreted, giving rise to a mythos that both frightened and fascinated the surrounding community. This process was amplified by fear among the elite, when a plantation owner or town official could not explain a series of unusual events, unaccounted deaths, sabotage, or sudden disappearances. They often attributed them to a single figure. The person became a scapegoat and a symbol, their reputation growing far beyond what any single act would normally warrant. At the same time, Oral traditions among the enslaved population preserved another dimension of the story. Tales of cunning, clever escapes, or strategic defiance highlighted the man's resourcefulness and courage, turning him into a hero in community memory. These stories celebrated agency and survival, creating a myth that offered hope and inspiration, even under brutal oppression. The tension between myth and reality often left historians struggling to separate fact from legend. Written records focused on the panic, fear, or economic impact caused by this individual, while oral histories emphasized strategy, intelligence, and resilience. Both perspectives are valuable. One shows the disruption of power, the other preserves the lived experience of the oppressed. Over time, the myth could overshadow the man. The individual became larger than life, with each retelling adding layers of intrigue, danger, or heroism. For the town, the myth was terrifying, a cautionary tale of what could happen if the system's control faltered. For the enslaved community, it was empowering, a story that validated resistance, intellect, and courage in a society determined to deny both. By 1856, in Natchez, the interplay of myth and man created a dual reality. To the elites, the figure represented uncontrollable fear and disruption. To the oppressed, he embodied survival and subtle rebellion. In both cases, the story transcended the individual, shaping memory, identity, and the understanding of power long after the events themselves had passed.